In this video, we'll introduce you to half steps and whole steps. As we move from note to note, we have ways of describing the distance between them. That distance is called an interval. The smallest intervals in our musical system are called half steps and whole steps. As we'll see shortly, two half steps span the same interval as one whole step, and that figures because 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1. You can learn to hear each and tell the difference. Every half step sounds like the same interval, even if the pair of pitches changes. Here's an example. That interval sounds the same as or. And likewise, every whole step, or sometimes we just call it a step, sounds like every other step. Here are two different ways to visualize them. On the keyboard, a half step is the next key regardless of color. Some half steps go from white key to white key, some from white to black, and some from black to white. Whole steps skip the next key to go to the one after it. These can span any possible pair of white and black keys. Let's look at a keyboard and see what we're talking about. So here's a half step that goes from E to F, where the very next note is the F without anything in between. Notice that there's no black key there. If I wanted to get the half step above A sharp, the very next note is this B. So now I'm going from black key to white key. Or if I wanted to go the half step higher than C, I could call that C sharp or D flat, but one way or another we're going from the white key to the black key. So those are all half steps. For a whole step, let's say I wanted a whole step higher than this C over there. I would skip the next note, that black key, and instead go to the D. If I want a whole step higher than the A flat over here, I would skip the white note in between and go to the next note after that. Or here's one that's a little more complicated. If I wanted the whole step higher than that E flat, I would skip the E natural there and use the next note, which is F. So E flat to F is also a whole step. A second way to visualize half steps and whole steps is by looking at a clock. A half step is like 1 hour forwards or backwards, and a whole step is like 2 hours forwards or backwards. So here's our clock scheme, and I put the chromatic notes all around the clock. So if I go clockwise, I'm going higher in pitch. If I go counterclockwise, I'm going lower in pitch. And notice that these notes here that I'm circling are like the white keys on the piano, and these notes here that I'm putting in boxes are like the black notes on the piano. Okay, one thing to notice, by the way, what this means is that if we keep going up by half steps, that's a C. I get back to the next C, an octave higher, by 12 half steps, and that's what we're saying when we use the clock. So C to C sharp, C sharp to D, D to D sharp, etc. If we do that 12 times, we're back on the pitch that we started, but an octave higher. If we go counterclockwise and down, then I've strung together 12 half steps, and now we're back to the C, but an octave lower. So what this means is that any two adjacent numbers, D to D sharp or D to E flat, is a half step. If I want a whole step, I have to go, I had said 2 hours one way or another. So 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, D to E, that's a whole step. 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, F sharp to G sharp, that's a whole step. Or I could go in the other direction, counterclockwise, and then I'd be moving down a whole step instead of up a whole step. Okay, you get the idea about why I use the clock and why that visual image can be helpful. So let's look at the actual notes. For half steps, I have two ways of writing the note a half step higher than C. I could write it as a C sharp or a D flat, and we had noted that they're the same key on the piano keyboard. So which one is correct? They both are, depending on the context. When the letter is the same, we call that a chromatic half step. And when we use a neighboring letter, we call that a diatonic half step. So let me show you both. So here, if I go from C to C sharp, we call that one a chromatic half step. I can take the same sound, and instead of using the same letter for the second note, I'll use the next letter up. Only this time it's the black key, so it's a D flat. It sounds the same, and sometimes we'll want to spell it that way, and sometimes we'll want to spell it that way. When we learn more about scales and things like that, then we'll learn which time to use when. We also noted that for whole steps, we're going to be using adjacent letters. So the whole step higher than F is going to be G. The whole step lower than F, we're going to use an E flat rather than a D sharp. We want the letters to be next to each other. And this is what I just explained to you. For whole steps, we'll almost always use a neighboring letter, so the whole step above C sharp is D sharp rather than E flat. A whole step lower than A flat is G flat rather than F sharp. One more feature. Looking at the white notes of the keyboard, we notice that from E to F in either direction, or from B to C in either direction, up or down, are both half steps. All the other pairs of adjacent white keys are whole steps. So here was our B to C half step and our E to F half step. Okay, every other C to D is a whole step, D to E is a whole step, F to G is a whole step, G to A, or A to B. So it's uniquely when B and C or when E and F follow each other. Those are half steps. All of the other adjacent letters, including using only one of these rather than both, like D to E or F to G, those are whole steps. Learn your whole steps and half steps first on the keyboard, and then writing or reading the notes on the musical staff. And just as a reminder, a half step using two versions of the same letter is a chromatic half step, and using the neighboring letters is a diatonic half step. All the whole steps will use adjacent letters. Just make sure there's only one possible note you're skipping over to make the whole step. So in other words, from F to G, you're not using the F sharp in between, and that's what makes that the whole step. There's a lot more to say about this, including some shortcuts that will help us understand this a little faster. But for starters, understand how the half steps and whole steps are defined. That's it for this video. Now go practice.